where we have a interactive Q&A afterwards. We like everybody to leave their cameras on to give it more of a feeling of a room. And if you have speaker suggestions, you can always email me or Peter Sadowski. The IFI is hosted by the University of Hawaii Cancer Center on the Kaka'ako campus in Honolulu, and the Artificial Intelligence Precision Health Institute is formed to foster learning and synergy between students at the University of Hawaii and researchers in these topics. Also, the Data Science Institute, hosted out of the Computer Science Department, also co-sponsors this event. And we give generous compensation to our speakers of a beer stein. And believe it or not, that usually gets high quality speakers. The paper of the month is from Dr. McWeeney and Dr. Bottomley, and is titled, "Just How Transformative Will AI ML Be for Immuno-Oncology?" And you can find that paper at the link given here. Finally, I just want to introduce Shannon McWeeney. She's a professor at Oregon Health and Science University, working at the intersection of computer science, biostats, and genetics. She's known for developing innovative computational frameworks that improve therapeutic prioritization and precision medicine, particularly in cancer research. She is the Chief Data Officer and Associate Director of the Data Science at OHSU Knight Center Institute, and directs medical bioinformatics for its precision oncology program. She also co-leads major NIH initiatives, including the ARTNet and Bridge to AI, focused on advancing data sharing and the responsible applications of AI in healthcare. So with that, I'll give you the floor, Dr. McWeeney, and I'm very happy to have you join us today.
Oh, I'm happy to be with you. I'm going to make a couple comments. When John and I spoke, the paper covers a lot. I'm going to briefly touch on kind of a key aspect of the paper, but then when he and I spoke, he asked me to focus a bit more because of how we've been recently interacting on federated learning. So this may be, and I tried to make sure that was clear in the title. So if there are questions about the paper, I'm happy to answer them. I don't want you to think based on our conversation, I've definitely shifted.
Of course.
And I just want to make sure so people aren't disappointed. But I am happy, and if we run out of time here, I'm also happy to answer any questions by email about the paper as well. Okay. And my dog is going to bark exactly at this moment. Okay. So we'll see how long Zoom, I don't know if you hear him or not. If you don't, that's wonderful. And sometimes Zoom does a great job of not catching a terrier. Okay. So as I mentioned, I really want to focus, again, based from the paper on kind of where we're thinking about, if you think about like the Gartner hype cycle, where are we in terms of the potential for AI? You know, I often use this analogy, how soon is now? I'll come back to that. But specifically, I also want to think about the role of federated learning in that and helping us achieve that when we think about AI-driven innovation. Okay, so sorry, my Zoom is acting funny. So just briefly as a backdrop, and I think for this group, you know this already, but you know, it's very clear that there's a number of areas where there will be impact for AI and ML in precision medicine. And specifically, I'm thinking about oncology, especially with this group and also given my work. And this figure from a paper from a couple of years ago kind of nicely highlights that when we think about the fact of so much that could be done in terms of preclinical research, target, discovery, target identification, molecular structures, clinical trials, obviously, and especially efficiencies in clinical trials, obviously care and diagnostics, right? So a number of areas. However, and this was actually the genesis for the paper, one that is the focus this week. One of the key things is, especially when we think about oncology, and we were asked specifically to be thinking about immuno-oncology in that paper, how soon are we really going to see this? We know AI and ML will be transformative, but the question is when. And so what we highlighted in the paper were 4 areas in which we believe that we will see, near and midterm gains. And I think we were very cautious in that about kind of talking about that. And one of them that might surprise you or be less exciting, but is actually really critical is operations. We touch on this in the paper a great deal. And I want to emphasize that because it is also one of the ways to fuel innovation. So cost savings, especially, and I'm really thinking about academic medical centers. So cost savings in clinical operations from AI can then be funneled back into more AI-driven innovation. And so if you were surprised when you read the paper that that's there, that's one of the reasons. It's also one of the low-hanging fruits of where we can really see this. Now, there's a number of factors that come into play here. Some of it is around maturity of the field. So we mentioned medical imaging. Imaging is really, especially if you're familiar with, for example, FDA approvals of AI and ML software as medical devices, the majority are in imaging, right? So it was a field that was much more mature, right, in terms of the algorithms and methods and a lot of the work that was being done clinically. So you have this idea of things that are lower risk like operations and have potentially high gains towards the innovation life cycle. Things where you have a lot of maturity like medical imaging, similar with EHR. We see right now with LLMs and generative AI, a lot of uses in terms of summarization of notes. And I'm happy to talk when we get to the discussion about some of the challenges and how we actually think about implementing that because we start to get into potentially higher risk with that. And then obviously clinical research, right? Clinical trials and where we see potential huge gains in terms of efficiencies, et cetera. So that was kind of the backdrop for the paper. And we touch on this idea of, sorry, the Zoom keeps moving. I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of, it's never done this before. And sorry, give me 1 second. There we go. The window was right exactly where I was trying to click. I talked a little bit about maturity, in the paper when we're thinking about things like imaging, medical imaging. But we have to think about overall this kind of characteristics because part of the issues with the hype, part of the issues with the overpromise is that we're not considering the maturity of the AI itself. So imaging is what we would consider to be very advanced in terms of AI maturity for research or even potential clinical applications. Also structural biology, really mature, very sophisticated algorithms, a real tremendous effort in terms of R&D, development, dollars, et cetera. Intermediate is clinical trials, right? That's where we really see that. And then you'll hear things like the digital twin, et cetera, which are very exciting, very sophisticated potential in terms of the modeling. Those are also, though, really in their infancy. And so I just kind of comment on here that, the things that you want to be thinking about is how much data is available to build the models. This is one of the reasons why for both structural biology and for imaging, they are so much further. If you think about the vast amount of medical imaging data that had been out there and had already been used for other types of even more simpler classification and other tasks. How much effort, and that again you see that very much in the advanced category, lots of effort from industry and academia. And then how well defined is the problem? And this is very, very important because where you see like digital twin, again, I think one of the reasons that it's still in its infancy, even though there's been so much work on this, has been that often the questions around that, what are the really clear predictive tasks or what we're trying to do, are much more diffuse versus the type of diagnostic, very specific tasks that we might see in imaging, for medical imaging, for example. Now, we talk about AI. I want to mention that I think about this in kind of 3 different levels. Obviously, artificial intelligence. We have the idea of augmented intelligence. And then for me personally, I really think about this in terms of actionable intelligence, because that's what we'd really be able to think about in terms of transformation if we're talking about things that might have started off in research and actually are going to move into the clinic or have a real translational impact in terms of cancer research, cancer care. So when we talk about actionable intelligence, I kind of define it along a number of axes. In a different talk, I would cover all of these. I'm just going to focus on a few of them for this talk because we're going to focus more on federated learning and how it's kind of being able to help us achieve some of the potential for AI and ML, especially in terms of innovation and model development. So the first 2 dimensions of this idea of actionable intelligence is the idea of completeness and relevance. And this is really critical when we think about the data that's being used for the predictive task. So do we have the right data for the question or the model? And remember, this always needs to be led by a very specific predictive task. Everything is going to depend on that. What is that task? How well specified it is? And then from that, we then say, okay, now given that, do I have the data that's complete, that's relevant, right, for that specific task? So when we think about this, you've, I know, heard that there are, especially as we think about the growing sophistication in machine learning models, that the data requirements keep increasing. How much data we need to achieve certain performances. And this is just a graph from a number of years ago where they were just thinking about kind of the shift from traditional machine learning to deep neural networks. And what we know very clearly is that the access to very large, diverse data sets ensures that the AI models that we develop will be generalizable. It'll help reduce bias and it'll improve predictive accuracy. We show this over and over again. Again, I'm going to stress here that besides it being a lot of data and diverse data, it really needs to be relevant for the task that you're thinking of. Now, I will mention that the Tang et al. Paper was not considering anything on the scale of data that is used for things like the LLMs. And so I'm just giving you an example here for ChatGPT-4 from OpenAI. It was around 1.7 trillion parameters and around 1 petabyte of training data. And that's a massive amount of data, which is why you can see that data sharing is key, right? A single institution alone, especially for a given predictive task. So that relevance of the task acts almost like another filter on this, right? In terms of narrowing how much data a single like we might have lots of imaging data, but if for the exact question that you're asking, it might only a subset might be relevant for that task. And so, the idea that single institutions or single sites are going to be able to do this alone for some of the model development is becoming more and more clear that it's unlikely. So data sharing is going to be critical. Now, I also want to point out, because I did make the comparison to OpenAI, I am not suggesting at all that academic medical centers should be trying to compete with the Meta and the OpenAIs of the world. And in fact, from a study a couple of years ago, they showed that when you think about what are the most significant machine learning models that have been produced in that year, the majority of them came from industry, with only a few coming from academia. So we're not going to try and compete on that level, but we actually have a lot of expertise in terms of model development and very much in terms of model fine tuning, because those are the strengths we have. If you think about the local data that you have, the expertise that you have, and that this can really serve as a translational R&D catalyst. So I don't want you to think, one, I'm arguing you need to data share so you can compete. You're still going to need a data share to create or even fine tune these models that are actually going to be much more relevant, especially when we think about predictive tasks for cancer care, oncology, precision oncology, et cetera. Now, another dimension, and this is really where federated learning comes in, is around accessibility, right? When we talk about actionable intelligence. So are we engaging all of our stakeholders? And is this actually, in terms of our AI and ML, is it accessible, but yet is it secure, equitable, and protecting privacy? And that's one of the challenges that we face. So right off the bat, I want to stress that AI and ML, especially in an academic medical center and in a cancer center framework where we really are serving, where our patients are our partners, we're using the data that they've provided, right, in partnership with them, with their consent, to try and move the needle, if you will, right, in terms of new treatments, new therapies, early detection, et cetera. They're often left out. So that's why I said this is kind of modified. You see many diagrams around who are the key stakeholders in computation. We're often leaving out the patients, and we can't do that. And in fact, we know that data sharing, especially from a cancer center perspective, improves patient outcomes, right? So we see this over and over again. So the question we want to think about is, why is data sharing so challenging? And also ethically, can we, is it really, aren't we responsible to really make sure that we're sharing the data? So this is Lori Becklin. She was in this case, author of an op-ed piece, but she was also a writer in Los Angeles. She had metastatic breast cancer. It had metastasized to almost every major site. When she was diagnosed, she was told that she would have weeks to live. She actually made it years, right? So she kind of defied the predictions given how serious and how far along, how far the disease had progressed in terms of her diagnosis when she was diagnosed. And she recognized when she was dying, and this op-ed actually got published shortly after she died, that a lot her data, which actually could help another metastatic, cancer patient who, has a similar phenotype in terms of the mutations, in terms of the, level of disease sites, et cetera, but also how she did with certain treatments, her experience, right? The idea that she wasn't in effect a one person clinical trial, especially when you're thinking about advanced metastatic disease, that data would likely, because of many of the legal and compliance, and even I would say some of the competitive aspects around clinical care, that data might not be shared, and that this wasn't in fact criminal. And so we really do want to think about how do we get around this. Now, there's a number of reasons why, right? So when we think about data sharing, one of the first models that came up early on was just centralized data sharing, right? And this is the idea, which is on the left, that we can take our data and, bring it all together. And so there'd be one site, you can kind of think about it as one operator who would have all of the data aggregated together and would actually run the model. That is very efficient. It's very accurate, but especially if you're thinking about the fact that these users are all academic medical centers or hospitals, this is a huge issue because you now have one operator who has direct access to very sensitive data. And we have regulatory and privacy concerns, HIPAA, if we're thinking about this internationally, GDPR, et cetera. So this doesn't scale. Also, moving the data, especially when talking about very large amounts of data, doesn't scale. So this is when we start to think that, which is on the right, about distributed learning, right? In which you're still having local models and local data, but then you're exchanging model parameters and building a global model. And this is a way to overcome the limitations in centralized data sharing. This is also a way to overcome some of the hurdles of why data was kind of staying locked at individual sites. And federated learning, which is our focus today, is one type of distributed learning. So our goal overall, when we think about this dimension of actionable intelligence, is that we want to be able to have model development that's secure, that's private, and that it's frictionless, right? And so definitely when we think about security for this, we think about frameworks like federated learning. And then I'm going to come back and come back to this. There are components of this infrastructure that are around privacy. And that's things like differential privacy, et cetera. And I'll come back to that. But those are two different dimensions, security and privacy, that we have to be considering about when we think about this type of distributed learning model or architecture. So as I mentioned, federated learning is one type of this distributed learning, and it's filling this critical gap because it allows this creation of collaborative, robust models without the data learning. And similar to what you saw in the other figure, right? At each site, they have their quote unquote private data. They are doing their local training, developing a local model, and then they're sharing this with, in terms of the model weights, with the federated learning server. It's doing aggregation, and then it creates a global model that can be shared back. So we had, and this is actually how John and I started talking, because I've been advising what we call like the second wave of this. We are OHSU and the Knight Cancer Institute. We're part of this first wave of NCI's attempt to really create a federated learning network for the cancer centers. And I say, that this is very much a early, collaboration. And we often thought of that as prototyping, even though we did successfully federate, and I'll talk about that. Because part of this was also to understand what the barriers were going to be. So in our case, we were focused on developing a multi-model deep learning model to predict tumor mutational burden in prostate cancer. And just to give a brief comment on this clinically, when we think about tumor mutational burden, we're going to be thinking about genomic characterization that has to happen of the tumor. And that can take, up to a week or more in terms of the time. And when we're thinking about the responsiveness to a tumor board, et cetera, when we're trying to think about clinical decision making, that can often be out of step in terms of the timing. So what we were interested in doing was actually predicting this status directly from H&E So this is histopathologic, whole slide images and clinical data. So bringing those two modalities together, not right. So can that alone do a sufficient job in predicting TMB status, which is actually an important correlate for thinking about response to therapy, prognosis, et cetera. Can we utilize that as a surrogate because the H&E images are easily available? It fits on the time frame where we would actually be able to, if we see a high enough accuracy and performance, potentially not have to have the genomic data as a step. So this was the kind of use case in terms of what we were interested in. And what that tells you is that we were thinking about two different data types then, imaging and the clinical data. Now, why multimodal? This was actually a key component of the pilot, was that they wanted it to be multimodal rather than just a single data type, right? So, this could have just been that we federate doing just clinical data, for example, or just imaging. The multimodal data is actually, when we think about true multimodal data integration, it's incredibly powerful. So what I don't want you to think about is that I'm just taking imaging and I'm taking clinical data and I'm kind of building models and then, at the very end, fusing them. That's a very late integration. And while that is technically multimodal data integration, there's actually much more powerful methods in terms of either earlier or mid integration of the data in which you're fusing the data much, much earlier. And when you do this, especially with the assumptions that this data is not just heterogeneous, but also interconnected, we actually can gain much more. And what we're seeing from these types of models is that we might use 5 or 6 different types of modalities. And later, if one is missing, because of the fact that they're interconnected, because there is, and this is a key assumption of multimodal AI, that there are these interacting connected components to the data types themselves, right, that are actually important for this predictive task. Then if one is missing later, the models actually still do very well, even if you don't have all of the modalities. So this is an exciting avenue. It is very nascent. I will mention this because if the fusion is early, if it's not late, for example, we actually lack many of the explainable AI types of metrics that we use, things like SHAP values. So those are great if you're doing late integration, because basically you can just, in an additive sense, what we have this idea of multimodal SHAP values where you can just add them up for the different modalities. But if you've done early integration, they don't work. So it's a very nascent area. It's a very exciting area. And it also brings in a different level of challenge because there might be different sensitivities of the data or different risks, which is why NCI was very interested in this. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but we were basically implementing the framework and then evaluating it. And we were thinking about this in terms of some key things you might think about, like bias, adversarial attacks. But we were also, and this is very important when you think about actually doing this, having all these cancer centers do this, we were really thinking about this in terms of what conflicts or challenges might arrive in terms of AI governance, and also in terms of, so IPS on here is integrity, privacy, and security. So we really wanted to say, okay, depending on how high risk the data was, or depending on how high risk the model was, what are the considerations that a cancer center might need to think about in order to be able to do this implementation? So we have a longstanding partnership with NVIDIA. We utilized NVFLARE, which is their federated learning framework. This is just an overview of all of the components. It is incredibly robust, and this was one of the reasons for it. For example, you have a number out of the box of federated learning algorithms that can be utilized, the workflows, the APIs, and then very importantly, and I'll come back to this, the privacy and security components, which became really critical for us. So it really does provide a lot of the tools and the frameworks that are necessary for a wide range of different types of federated learning applications. Now, in federated learning in general, but I'm highlighting this from NVFLARE, you do have this idea of different roles, right? So we were hosting the NVFLARE server at OHSU, and so we have a project administration role. You also, though, have the NV clients, and they have various roles. And you'll notice in here that you'll see this idea of the privacy and security kind of officials or compliance at the individual sites being critical, as well as where the server is being implemented. And then obviously AI governance as well. So you can see that on here, it's, different roles have different tasks in terms of if they're just observing, if they're running jobs, if they're actually certifying the model, etc. And a key thing that came up immediately is what do they have access to? And so this gets at some of the privacy components. So remember, when we think about privacy and security, the federated learning is really trying to help with the security piece. We still have to address the privacy component. So as I mentioned to you, there are a couple of, there's a number of different options that are within the NV-FLAIR framework. One of them is differential privacy. And so with differential privacy, as you probably know, when we're thinking about these model updates, what's happening is that you're removing a portion of the update and you're actually adding noise to it. And so the more noise that you add, the more you're increasing the privacy, right? Because what are we thinking about with this privacy? We're worried about things like re-identification of individuals or information leakage, et cetera, right? So the more noise that I add in the resulting update, I'm increasing the privacy. Now, a drawback of this is that while this is fantastic in that for very high risk, you can actually certify the level of privacy statistically that is being provided, it does result in poorer model performance, and that's highlighted in this paper here. So what is another option? Another option, which is also available in NV-FLAIR, is homomorphic encryption. And this is really important, especially if in a federated learning context, you don't trust the server. So if it's a company or industry, not a trusted partner necessarily, although we'd have to say, would an academic medical center be really doing this? But just the idea that there's more concerns, again, especially because of higher risk. So this is a form of encryption that permits the users to perform the computations on encrypted data. So again, very, very strong from a privacy context. The downside is that it does increase the necessary computational resources and time, which is a consideration that needs to be factored in. And there are other models as well, but these are the kinds of things that you have to be thinking about. And these were some of the things that we were evaluating. Now, what happened from our pilot collaboration? We did do successful federation. We found that in the best performance, we were seeing and again, this is specific to the TMB predictive task. We were seeing the federated model in the best performance case outperform the local model in terms of accuracy. We also did a bunch of work with NVIDIA on improving cloud provisioning workflow and the documentation that goes with that. And there's a GitHub repository for that. And then very importantly, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this, we did develop this risk framework to support academic medical centers. Now, there's a number of challenges that we ran into that I think are really clear. So one is the risk of not just the data, but also the model. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The other is when we think about this, especially when sites are like, yes, I have tons of data. I want to do this. This is great. It's not just that the data is available, but what's the level of annotation and quality and very important relevance for this task. And then that there will be potentially, depending on the model and the way that it's set up, optimization and stability assessments and evaluations that'll have to be done. And I'm highlighting here from OHSU at the time, 2 individuals, Dirk and Dan, who were critical for this. I want to also mention we worked really closely with NCI as well, and I do not have them on here just because given the current changes that are happening nationally, I had not gotten approval about using their names given the short time frame in which I was invited for this talk. But this was very much a collaboration with a number of key individuals at NCI. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I want to have time for questions, but I want to mention a couple of things to you. One of the things that we came back with is for our AI governance committee, which actually oversees any use and adoption of AI at our institution for all of our missions, research, education, and clinical care. We came back with a number of recommendations about things that they would want to be considering, including how well the model is documented, if we're using a model that's already been developed, if it's been validated, and if it's really suitable for the task. We also talked about different types of certification. And again, I'll highlight this really depends on the level of risk. but different levels of certification and evaluation that could be done in pre-training and things that could be done prior to deployment, especially if you were looking at this for real adoption. And then finally, we came up with, and this is a very simplified view of this kind of framework around what you had to think about when you were setting up federated learning, depending on this combination of the risk for the data and the model. And I think this was really important because a lot of academic medical centers think about the risks in terms of the data and aren't always thinking about the models themselves, which is why we have a number of those recommendations for that. And so you can see that things like the pre-training evaluation and certification, that's this PTEC, come into play when you have a very high-risk model and you have very high-risk data. Versus in the low-risk case, where you basically could have an expedited review. So we're thinking about potentially even de-identified data, or data with, or potentially a limited data set and a model that potentially is very, very low risk. Now, this matters not just beyond the need that we want to share to improve patient outcomes and to be able to develop these models. This is also becoming a requirement because of the regulatory landscape. So this is from a really fantastic paper from a few years ago that was actually looking at, especially in imaging, FDA approved AI ML software as medical devices. So, algorithms that have been approved. And what they were seeing is that there was actually tremendous drift at different sites in terms of, and often they could be approved with very few sites even being part of that. So this is a great concern to the FDA. We know model drift exists, and we definitely know now very clearly in the FDA landscape about these training versus operational site differences. And so this has led to the FDA kind of really rethinking the frameworks around this. And there will become these requirements for validation where academic medical centers, cancer centers will be asked to contribute to being part of the evaluation or being part of the testing to help support the FDA approval process for many of these devices. So we really need to be thinking about this collectively because we know how critical this is when we think about, especially at the stage of regulatory for FDA, because you're now thinking about things that are going to be part of potentially clinical care. Now, I will mention one other note before we go into the discussion. You want to also say, well, what if the data does have to move? Because everything that we've been talking about is where the data is not moving. And there are some gray zones. So as John mentioned, I'm one of the PIs for Bridge to AI, which is a NIH Common Fund project. And we've been thinking a lot about this because our focus is multimodal data. And we have a lot of data types. We have, for example, 7 different types of retinal imaging. We have environmental home sensors. We have wearable devices, et cetera. Many of those are not considered to be protected data or sensitive data. However, we recognize that in the future, they may be. So we do have data attestations, data use agreements, et cetera, in place, right, to do this. But there is a portion of the data when it's being used for certain use cases where the data can, be, you sign the attestations and you're authenticated in terms of your identity and you can download the data. And so because there is the potential that this can be sensitive data in the future, or because of the fact that you have all of this multimodal data on a very large cohort of individuals, we have been working on, and this was really spearheaded by Ben Cordier at OHSU, work on what we call data-derived identity verification, where you're establishing the provenance of any copy of a data set because we are embedding it with a unique cryptographically verifiable identity. And you can think about this akin to digital watermarking or digital fingerprinting. But we've been doing this at scale now since the project launched in terms of all the data that's being downloaded through that first mechanism where there's not the data use agreement in place. And then finally, I just want to remind you that this all comes into context, all of this, when we talk about how soon is now, when we talk about, when are we really going to see these transformations, everything comes back to the data, not just the data sharing that it is actually AI ready. And I wanted to highlight this paper that came out of the consortium last year. This came from the Bridge to AI consortium. And this is kind of the different dimensionalities when we think about AI being ready. And obviously, especially when we think about ethics and we think about computability, et cetera, things like federated learning or even the work that we were doing in terms of data protection really come into play here and are going to be critical. So with that, I just want to acknowledge that I'm presenting lots of pieces from a lot of work that is, not me, but many people that I work with and I'm lucky to work with. And I'm happy to take any questions.